Today, I'm going to discuss how an e-ink tablet from Sony became an integral part of my book writing process. Now, part of this involves a broader conversation about how I edit my books, so if you prefer to skip right to the e-ink tablet review, I left the timestamp in the description. However, I think you might find the entire video helpful, especially if you write and edit books yourself. You know, editing can often take longer than writing a book's first draft, and it sometimes feels as if there's an infinite amount of rewriting to be done. The main question that I ask myself is, how do I know when a book is done? Well, a few people have asked me the same question about my paintings, from my days working with oils to my current digital workflow. The answer always boils down to this. After a few days break, if I look at the painting and see nothing I'd like to change, then it's done. It's simple. Novels aren't so easy to judge at a glance, which is why editing is such a complicated topic. First off, when do you edit? Is it only after your first draft, or does it happen concurrently? Then how do you go about editing? There's endless approaches and no perfect answers. Writing and publishing 5 novels has taught me a lot about my process, which I've broken into 5 main steps. Step 1, the prototype. Lots of game designers build a much smaller version of their game to work out the mechanics, while artists might sketch their vision before starting on their final canvas. You might guess that for a novel, an outline is the equivalent of a prototype, but I don't think that's quite right. An outline doesn't give you a sense of how your novel will feel to read, and I find it incredibly important to establish the book's tone before writing the first draft. To do this, I write and completely edit the first chapter. And once I'm satisfied with the first chapter, I don't do any more editing aside from basic spell checking until I finish the entire first draft. Editing along the way just saps my forward momentum. Step 2. Rewrites. Rewriting what I've already written is spectacular fun, and I'm not even being sarcastic. My first draft is awfully written, and it's usually a struggle to translate my outline into chapters, scenes, descriptions, and dialogue, but once all that exists, fine-tuning it is a joy. I get to take hastily written paragraphs and expand upon them without the stress of worrying about writing what comes after. Let's look at an example paragraph from a first draft. A metal lance colored to match the desert background pierced Caden's torso before he sensed its approach. He darted away to avoid another 3 projectiles, since he doubted his ability to wrestle away control of them from Severon's impenetrable affinite bond. As you can tell, this is pretty bland, and it's more a reminder for my future self to rewrite it than anything I'd plan on having a reader see. And when editing, I keep the paragraph in place, hit return a couple times, and rewrite the section from scratch. Caden didn't see the metal lance until the sun struck its barbed point at just the right angle, sending a dancing array of lights spinning across the shadowed side of a tall dune. It took another second for him to locate the lance itself, which Severon had camouflaged to match the desert below. By the time Caden thought to twist aside, the lance's spiked edge had already torn through his abdomen, stopping when it impacted his reinforced spine with a solid crunch. He reached to pull it from his body, only to find its spikes had sent anchoring tendrils snaking through his chest. Removing them with his ethereal hand would take only seconds, but Severon didn't give him even a single moment to recover. With an aggravated grunt, Caden instead snapped the exposed spear from his body and dove aside just as a second lance whipped by, close enough to carve a deep line across his cheek. Now, the description more closely resembles what I imagined of the scene, so hopefully the reader can imagine it too. There's still stuff in there I don't like, and maybe I've gone a bit too overboard with too much description, but I've done what I plan to do for my second draft: deepen, improve, and expand upon what I hastily wrote in my first draft. This is a time-consuming process. I go through the whole manuscript, treating every sentence, paragraph, and line of dialogue like I treated the example above. Once I've completed this process, I move on to the least fun stage: letting technology tell me how much I suck at writing. Step 3. Computer-assisted edits. I use 2 applications to edit my writing, PRoWritingAid and Grammarly. PRoWritingAid is both a powerful and dangerous tool. Powerful because it points out lots of stuff I missed, more on this in a minute, and dangerous because if you spend too much time following all its rules, you run the risk of draining personality from your writing. It's just a piece of software after all, and some of its functions work by comparing your writing to an average of others' writing to give your work a readability score, among other dubiously useful metrics. And honestly, if you follow all of its rules, you'll wind up removing potentially interesting language that doesn't necessarily conform to the standard. And you'll note that you can actually open Scrivener documents in PRoWritingAid. And since I use Scrivener almost exclusively for my writing, that's a major bonus. When you first open a file, it starts performing a real-time check across the document you have selected, which I find incredibly annoying and distracting. I far prefer to focus on each of the different issue categories it flags one at a time, so I simply click the real-time button to turn off this feature. Next, I click the combo button. Depending upon how you write, some of these metrics will be more or less useful. For example, if you tend to overuse adverbs, your document might be littered with highlights. And I find the sticky sentences feature a great tool for confusing sentences that might hamper a reader's flow, and I wind up rewriting most of these. The application will also search for overused words, another metric I pay close attention to. A quick warning though about PRoWritingAid. While it's a powerful tool, it's also powerfully janky. In particular, it doesn't always save your edits, especially if you're syncing files via Dropbox. After a ton of experimentation and research, I determined the safest course is to copy and paste my edited chapters into a new document as a backup. Still, the utility it provides is worth the annoyance. Once that's done, I run my writing through Grammarly, which does a much better job of discovering spelling and grammar mistakes. However, the app is wrong enough times that you need to keep a very close eye on things. If you don't, you'll wind up correcting sentences and introducing additional errors. Like PRoWritingAid though, the utility outweighs the annoyance. Again, to reiterate my earlier warning, don't let these programs override your instincts. There are often cases where something you've written might be technically incorrect or too complex from a computer's point of view, but these kind of creative flourishes are what gives your writing character. Don't erase all individuality from your prose, in other words. Anyway, once all that busy work is out of the way, it's time to introduce your book to someone besides yourself. Step 4, work with an editor. If you work with an editor, something I've done a couple of times, give your book to them. If not, try to find some literate friends to give feedback. Don't necessarily follow every bit of advice you receive, but definitely value the fresh perspective. I plan on talking about this step more in another video, so I'll leave it at that for now. Step 5, print your book. Finally, we arrive at step 5 and the main point of this video, printing the book. At least, I used to print my book before I bought this handy e-ink tablet. When you've been staring at your written words on a screen for months or years, you tend to stop truly reading what's on the page and instead read what you think is there. This can cause you to miss obvious errors, yeah, but it can also cause you to miss areas that just don't read well. Perhaps surprisingly, altering the format in which you read the book is like seeing it with fresh eyes. I used to print out my manuscript at least a couple of times during the editing process, double-sided, double-spaced, so I could take notes in between lines. This wasted an astronomical amount of paper, required multiple binders, and often led to me missing notes I took when later incorporating them into the text. Now, I'm not sure where the balance lies from an environmental perspective in terms of paper versus a piece of consumer electronics. There's a not insignificant environmental impact associated with every electronic device you buy, and that impact increases as you use electricity over time and also varies based on how you dispose of the device once it no longer functions. Paper might have a more straightforward carbon footprint, but it's also less simple when you take into account the printer, ink, and other devices that make paper useful. I actually spent a few hours reviewing research on the topic before making the purchase, and I honestly didn't come out the other end with any level of certainty that either decision was more or less environmentally friendly in the long run. So I wound up basing my decision on convenience and decided to purchase an e-ink tablet. E-ink resembles paper in that the screen doesn't emit light. Most people have probably had a chance to experience e-ink by now, but I remember when the first Kindle came out and I was shocked at how the letters appeared almost as ink printed on a grayish paper. These days, e-ink displays have evolved to include much higher contrast, resolution, and refresh rates, but the idea is still the same. Also, reading on them theoretically reduces eye strain when compared to a typical display, though I've seen contradictory studies on that. Subjectively though, the experience is just far more pleasant. So I decided I wanted an e-ink display. Then what? I knew my two main requirements were the screen size must be at least roughly matching an 8x11 sheet of paper, and I must be able to write on the screen with a stylus. Remember, I'm not just reading the work, I'm writing notes in between lines and in the margins, sometimes a whole lot of notes. Then I listed a couple other things that would be nice to have. Wireless syncing of files with a service I already use like Dropbox, and a color display since I enjoy writing in different colors for different types of notes. Needless to say, there weren't a ton of options in 2017 when I made my purchase. There weren't any options that met all my desires, nor are there any today. First of all, color e-ink displays are still in their infancy, even now, with e-ink Gallery 3 technology just rolling out to new devices. Older color e-ink displays tend to make too many compromises on resolution and contrast, but this latest update seems promising. I also gave up on wireless syncing since it was just for convenience and wouldn't ruin the experience. That left me with my requirement for a stylus and a large screen. The only real option, at least in the United States at the time, was the Sony DPT-RP1. As an aside, for a company that coined the iconic Walkman, Sony's recent track record of naming its products is hilariously bad, and this tablet is no exception. Sometimes I imagine their product teams actively trying to come up with the least evocative and most forgettable names possible. Anyway, I bought the tablet for $700, which is, I think, extraordinarily expensive for a single use case device. Still, it's held up beautifully over the past 5 or 6 years, and I have no desire to replace it anytime soon. To transfer documents, you'll need the digital paper app on your computer. From there, you can send documents via Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, or USB. I stick with USB because the wireless data transfer function has been unreliable just enough times to annoy me. Being from 2017, it uses a micro USB connection, which is increasingly frustrating in 2023, when most everything I have uses USB-C. One downside that doesn't really matter to me is that this thing only reads PDFs. In other words, if you were considering reading ebooks on the tablet, look elsewhere. You'll still need an e-reader for that. From what I can tell, the Sony tablet was aimed primarily at academics who can review many hundreds, if not thousands of PDFs per year depending upon their chosen field. When I'm ready to edit, I easily compile my book in Scrivener, formatted with double spacing to fit an 8x11 page. The tablet's 13.3-inch screen is similarly sized to a standard sheet of printer paper, so that dimension works well. There's not a whole lot to the tablet's interface. Unlike more modern e-ink tablets that run a modified version of Android, some of which even support the Google Play Store, the Sony uses proprietary software with very few settings. Really, there's not much to see or discuss here. Pressing the only button on the face of the tablet opens a quick access menu where you can create a new note or look at your documents list. I don't use the tablet to take notes, really, so I always just visit the document screen. From here, I click into the book I'm editing. Swiping on the screen turns pages, and that's about it. The stylus is good, but not great. It has a nice heft without being burdensome, and the nib generates a satisfying amount of friction to replicate the feel of pen or maybe pencil on paper. If you've ever drawn with an Apple Pencil on an iPad, you know how frustratingly slippy the experience is. The Sony doesn't suffer from the same issue, though the added friction does mean that the nibs wear out far more quickly. And the e-ink screen is responsive enough not to be distracting, though there is a noticeable lag and lack of smoothness to the letters. And when you stop writing a line, the screen does a sort of local refresh that blinks your text in a way you might find annoying. I do love that holding down the stylus's button activates the eraser. This is extremely handy. What I don't like is the floppy top piece that hides the micro USB charging port. This is an active stylus, meaning it needs regular charging to function, and the end piece often comes loose just even while writing. Luckily, it's attached by a piece of plastic, but it's still frustrating when it happens. Speaking of charging, the tablet has never gotten great battery life. It's totally usable, but a couple full days of editing will drain it. It's not like your Kindle, which can sometimes go a couple weeks or longer without needing a charge. The biggest downside for me is probably the lack of a front light. I'm so used to screens emitting light that I sometimes forget just how much light you really need to read comfortably. The screen's contrast isn't quite up to snuff with the latest e-ink technology, so more light tends to be necessary. I don't find it comfortable to read unless I have a desk lamp or similar light pointed right at it. Other than that though, I don't have any major complaints. I got a decent case from Sony which keeps the tablet protected while I'm not using it, and it's been working fine for years. If you're in the market today, there's still not really many or any better options at this 13.3-inch screen size. There's the Boox Tab X, which does have a built-in light, but is notoriously difficult to operate for English-speaking users and basically has zero support. Then there's a few other Chinese devices that you may or may not be able to buy internationally, like the Hanvan Europa ED310, the Javido Music Ready aimed at musicians, and the Fujitsu, I think it's Quaderno A4. Anyway, the Boox is probably the most reasonable of these choices. If you're okay with a 10-inch screen, your options expand considerably. For example, Amazon recently launched the Kindle Scribe, and the Remarkable 2 tablet does a decent job as well. But I far prefer the A4 size display, so I won't be switching to either of these devices anytime soon. When I'm done editing on my Sony tablet, I just drag the files back to my PC and line them up next to my Scrivener document. My notes show up in color on my monitor, which makes finding each note easy. Some of the notes are word or sentence corrections, while other times I just mark areas that don't read smoothly to go over later. For each note, I search my Scrivener chapter for the section I want to edit, make the changes, and voila! The process takes a few hours, but it's well worth the effort. I might have read a paragraph 100 times before, but rereading it on the tablet makes me see how stilted it is. So that's how I use an e-ink tablet as part of my editing process. If you're a writer who stares at your work on the same screen day in and day out, I strongly recommend you switch things up too. Use an e-ink tablet, print it out, or just look at it on your phone. Even that helps. If you're still not convinced though, another trick I use is to read the book out loud, since this forces you to slow down and actually read every word. I hope this look into my editing process sparks some ideas for your process. If you have any tricks you recommend, do let me know in the comments. Next week, I'll be shifting topics a bit and discussing my experience as an anxiety-ridden and highly agoraphobic author who lives in New York City. So stay tuned for what's sure to be some entertaining insanity, and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.